bum 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 ba da 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 ya da da la 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 da da ya da da ya da 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 ah na 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 da 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 la 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 ya la 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 ba dum ba dum ba dum ba da yum bum ba dum ba la 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 ya da ya la 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 ya da ya da ay ya da bum bum bum. Good evening, good Vok Shavua Tov. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa Great Neck Shandor in the Bronx, Arlene in Vail, Arizona, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paula likes the singing, Larry in Queens, Bill in mid-Missouri, Ella's in the house, Jackson in Portland, Marjorie in Virginia. Welcome everybody. Our daf is Yud Gimel, page 13 here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 1. Betrothal is created either by means of money or its equivalent, a document, or sexual intercourse. And then a woman acquires herself, meaning she leaves marriage either through a document, which is a get, the bill of divorce, or if the husband dies. We saw in the last few days that sexual intercourse might be a valid method of creating betrothal by Torah law, but in practice it's very unsavory. They didn't want witnesses to come and witness the man and women going into seclusion in order to perform this act. And so by rabbinic decree, that was a prohibited method of creating betrothal. We continue this discussion with an incident on page 13a, a few paragraphs from the top. The Gemara further relates there was a certain woman who was selling belts, and a certain man came and snatched a belt from her, and she said to him, "Give it to me." And he said to her, "If I give it to you, will you be betrothed to me?" And she took it and was silent. And Rav Nachman said she could say, "Yes, I took it, but I took my property." There is no proof that she agreed to accept it as a betrothal, right? He said, "Take this belt, and we will be betrothed together," and she took the belt. So one side of the argument is, okay, so he was trying to create betrothal, and she showed her assent to that by taking the belt. But the context matters. The first thing he did is he took the belt from her. So she didn't want to say anything, but what she wants is her property back, lest this crazy man do something, dangerous or further craziness. So she didn't say anything, but she took her own belt back. How could we say that she consented to a betrothal through this action? Rav Nachman says, no way. But Rava raises an objection to the opinion of Rav Nachman. What's Rava going to say? From a baraisa, if a man betrothed a woman with property that was taken by robbery, or with property taken by a forced transaction when the owner was reluctant to sell, or with property that was taken by theft, or if he grabbed a seller from her hand and betrothed her with it, she is betrothed. I mean, this sounds crazy. You would think that the minimum requirement for a guy who's going to use money or the equivalent of money to be the item that is transferred to her in order to create betrothal with money or its equivalent, you would think it would be necessary that the money belong to him. According to this baraisa, no. How can that be? If so, why does Rav Nachman say here that when he took it from her and betrothed her, she is not betrothed? And Rav Nachman answered there in that baraisa is referring to a case where he had previously arranged to marry her, and therefore she remained silent. if she remained silent, she certainly agreed to the betrothal. Okay, so this couple had already made some kind of arrangement. She had already shown that she had consented to become betrothed to this guy. Maybe she didn't have good taste in finding husbands, given that this guy's some kind of a thief. But hey, maybe we don't know so much about his situation, and maybe he stole the item, maybe he was taking something back that somebody had taken from him, we're not sure. Bottom line, he and she came to a meeting of the minds. They agreed to create betrothal between them, and then he gave her an item that was worth a peruta or more. The fact that he might be liable to theft, that he might have to replace this item from somebody that he took it from, that's a separate issue. This is one of the many examples where we have to understand that the sages are not condoning that he should steal something in order to create betrothal with it. They're just not analyzing that part of the question right now, whether he's guilty for theft and what's going on. What they're looking at is, can she silently consent to betrothal without saying that she agrees when she takes this item, even if the item has questionable origin? The answer seems to be, well, silence equals yes only when she's already previously verbally said yes. So they knew that there was an arrangement between them, and he was relying on that when he gave her the item. And from where do you say that there's a difference between a case where he had previously arranged to marry her and where he had not arranged to do so? Well, as it is taught in a Baraisa, that with regard to a man who said to a woman, take this Sela coin that I owe you, and he went back and said to her, be betrothed to me with it. Right, so he already owed her some money, and then he paid back the money. And then he comes back, not at the same moment as when he paid back the money, but later and said, you know that money that I borrowed from you and then I paid you back? Well, when I paid it back to you, why don't we use that transfer of money from me to you as the betrothal money, and let's be betrothed. Right, that's the case they're now talking about. So in this case where the man said to the woman, take this seller that I owe you, and then he went back and said to her, be betrothed to me with it, if he said this at the time the money was given and she wanted it, then she's betrothed. But if she did not want it, she is not betrothed. So if he issued his statement after the money was given, then even if she wanted it, she is not betrothed. You can't retroactively say, be betrothed to me with the money I gave you yesterday. Whether I was giving it to you or gifting it to you or paying it back to you from a loan, it doesn't matter. He can't create the betrothal after the fact with money transferred yesterday. Rav Nachman clarifies, what is the meaning in this case of she wanted and what is the meaning of she did not want? If we say that she wanted means that she said yes, and she did not want means that she explicitly said no, well, it can be inferred that if she was silent, it is a valid betrothal. But if so, wait a minute. If we say that she wanted means that she said yes, and she did not want means that she explicitly said no, it can be inferred that if she was silent, it is a valid betrothal. But if so, let the Baraisa teach simply that she is betrothed without specification, as it did there in the previous case with regard to one who said, take this sela as a deposit. It is obvious that if she explicitly said no, she is not betrothed. Rather, the phrase she wanted means she said yes, and she did not want means that she remained silent. And in this case of silence, the Baraisa taught that she is not betrothed. And what is the reason she is not betrothed if she remains silent? It is that she can say, yes, I took the money, but I took my own property back. I did not intend to become betrothed by it. But this interpretation is difficult with regard to that which we learned, that if a man betrothed her with property that was taken by robbery, with property that was taken by a forced transaction, with property that was taken by theft, or if he grabbed a sela from her hand and betrothed her with it, then she is betrothed. So rather, isn't it correct to conclude from it that this ruling that she is betrothed if she was silent must be referring to a case where he arranged the marriage beforehand? Whereas this ruling that she is not betrothed when she remained silent is referring to a situation where he did not arrange it beforehand. And the Gemara leaves off there. So that the dispositive issue is, had they already arranged their marriage such that from her silence we can infer consent, because she'd already given the consent and now she just receives the coin and it doesn't really matter the origin of the coin. She'd already consented to the marriage, and now he's giving her something, and she takes it. So in that context, it means it makes sense because she said yes before the money was transferred. Now, the Gemara relates, when Rabbi Asi died, the sages assembled to collect his statements, i.e. they wished to review his rulings of law, lest they be forgotten. So a certain member of the sages, and Rabbi Yaakov was his name, said to them, this is what Rabbi Asi said that Rabbi Mani said, just as a woman cannot be acquired by less than the value of one peruta, so too land cannot be acquired by less than the value of one peruta. And they said to him, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, although a woman cannot be acquired by less than the value of one peruta, land can be acquired by less than the value of one peruta. Right, so you can see why we're discussing these teachings that Rabbi Asi left behind after he died, that his students want to gather together, make sure they understand them properly, because it keys off this idea that a woman can be betrothed with no less than one peruta or something worth one peruta. But that's where we start, and now we're going on a bit of a digression. So Rabbi Yaakov said to them, when that baraisa is taught to the effect that land can be acquired by less than the value of one peruta, but a woman cannot, it was with regard to acquisition through symbolic exchange, i.e., a legal act of acquisition formalizing the transfer of ownership of an article, meaning I can sell you a field, right? Now, you give me money for the field. Maybe you give me $1 million for this big farm field, right? So I receive the money. When I receive the money from you, have you taken possession of the field? No. Under Jewish law, you have to do some kind of positive act of acquisition, right? And so you can take a handkerchief from me. I can hand you a handkerchief. The handkerchief is worth less than one peruta, but we're doing a formal act that witnesses can see, so that they see that, yes, I received the money, or maybe I didn't receive the money, but I agree that you owe me the money, but I'm letting you now, at this moment, take possession of the field by handing you this handkerchief in the presence of witnesses. We can do that with a transfer of land. We cannot do that to create betrothal, right? That symbolic exchange known as a kinyan does not work to create betrothal, even though betrothal is called acquiring a woman, but we can do it in the case of land. So that's what they're talking about here. And that handkerchief does not have to be worth one peruta, even though by virtue of taking that handkerchief, the buyer acquires a fabulously valuable piece of land. Maybe he's buying Disneyland, for billions of dollars, but he doesn't take possession of it until he takes that handkerchief worth less than a penny. Okay. So where am I? With regard to symbolic exchange. As it is taught in a baraisa, one can acquire land and movable items through a symbolic exchange by giving a vessel, even though it is not worth one peruta. So they then sat and said additional statements in the name of Rabbi Asi. Now that we're talking about Rabbi Asi and what he said about land versus betrothal, worth one. The exchange being worth less than a peruta, etc. Now we're going to have additional statements of Rabbi Asi. One statement concerned that which Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, anyone who does not know the nature of bills of divorce, of gets, and betrothals should have no dealings in them, as his ignorance might lead people to commit serious sins. And it was in this context that Rabbi Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and those who deal with these issues without proper knowledge are worse for the world than the generation of the flood. Right? The generation of the flood were people that were so steeped in wickedness that they brought on the destruction of everyone in the world except for Noah and his family who were saved in the ark. I mean, that's a pretty bad group of people with a bad effect and a bad outcome on the whole human race. Are you really going to say that judges who are ignorant in the nuances of the law of betrothal and divorce are worse for the world than the generation that brought the flood into the world? How could you possibly say that, Rabbi Asi? Well, as it is stated, Hosea 4:2, swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all bounds and blood touches blood. Now that's about the generations of the flood. And the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that this verse is referring to individuals of this kind, not the people from the flood, but rather these judges who are ignorant of the law of betrothal and divorce. And the Gemara explains, as Rav Yosef translated the phrase, and committing adultery, they break all bounds, and blood touches blood. As they give birth to children through the wives of others, they add sins upon sins. You see, the generation of the flood, they were doing all kinds of wickedness and immorality and murder and stealing and incest and who knows what they were doing, but it was out in the open. These judges who don't understand the law of divorce and the law of betrothal, they could give rulings that create situations where a couple who thinks they're divorced aren't divorced, and then the woman goes out and marries another man, and she thinks she's married, their children are legitimate, but they're not, and so they're sending momsers out into the world, illegitimate children who marry other illegitimate who marry legitimate children, and create, a spread of momsers and illegitimacy, and that this is incredibly harmful to the world. And it is written, blood touches blood, as they give birth to children through the wives of others. They add sins upon sins. And it is written in the next verse, Hosea 4:3, therefore the land mourns, and everyone who dwells there languishes with the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, and the fishes of the sea are also taken away. And this indicates that those who cause illegitimate children to be born lead to such a great tragedy that even the fish of the sea will die. Whereas in the generation of the flood, the decree was not imposed upon the fish in the sea. All the animals and the people on land died, but the flood did not kill the fish in the sea, whereas creating these huge numbers of illegitimate children will harm the world so much that even fish in the sea will die. In terms of the flood, Genesis 7:22, whatever was on dry land died. The explicit mention of dry land indicates that the fish in the sea did not die. But here, in the punishment described in the verses in Hosea, even the fish in the sea died. And the Gemara asks, but one can say that this punishment is not administered until they perform all of them, i.e., only if they commit all the sins mentioned in Hosea 4:2 will this outcome come about. Including taking false oaths, committing murder, and stealing. And the Gemara answers, it should not enter your mind to say this, as it is written, Jeremiah 23:10, for because of swearing, the land mourns. And this verse teaches that on account of taking false oaths alone, the world can be destroyed, from which it may be inferred that each of these acts on its own is enough to warrant destruction. And the Gemara further asks, but one can say that taking a false oath is distinct, as it involves the desecration of God's name, and these other sins are distinct, i.e. that they are less severe offenses that entail a less serious punishment. Therefore, it is possible that this great tragedy will result only if one performs all of them. Now we're on 13b. And the Gemara explains, is it written, and they break all bounds, with the conjunction and they will break all bounds? And which would indicate that all the sins included are one unit. Rather, it is written, they break all bounds, without an and at the front of that, from which it may be inferred that this punishment is given separately for each one of these sins. Now, evidently, there's a little bit of hyperbole here, but, when the sages are speaking in a possibly hyperbolic manner, they want to bring home that it's a big deal, right? They're really speaking to their own right here. Don't get involved in telling people whether a betrothal was created or not, whether a divorce was created or not, unless you are incredibly skilled in that area of law, because a mistake could have severe and tragic consequences. New subject. They then sat and said additional statements in the name of Rav Asi, one of which concerned that which we learned in a Mishnah, Kinim 2:5, with regard to a woman after childbirth who brought her sin offering for her ritual purification and died. The heirs bring her burnt offering to fulfill her remaining sacrificial obligations. Right? When the temple is standing, if a woman gives birth to a child, she brings a couple of offerings, a sin offering and a burnt offering at the temple. So if she set aside these animals and she was able to bring the sin offering, but then she died before bringing the burnt offering, well then who owns the burnt offering? Her heirs. Right? So this animal designated to be the burnt offering, her heirs own it. Do they bring that burnt offering on behalf of their mother, who meanwhile has perished? That's the question being asked. So Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and this is the law, right, so according to Rav Asi, they do bring it. The heirs are obligated to bring that burnt offering to the temple. And Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and this is the law only when the woman herself had already separated, i.e. had already designated the animal for the burnt offering in her lifetime. But if she had not separated in her lifetime, then no, the heirs are not required to bring a burnt offering on her behalf. She managed to bring the sin offering. She had not yet brought the burnt offering. If she had not set that animal aside to be the burnt offering, the heirs don't have to designate such an animal and bring it on her behalf, because she's no longer obligated to bring that burnt offering because she died. Now the Gemara concludes, so apparently we learn out from this that Shmuel maintains that the property of a debtor is not liened by Torah law. In other words, one does not say that because she was required to bring a burnt offering, there is a lien on her property and the debt must be paid even if she did not set aside the animal before her death. So Rabbi Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says this is the law even though she did not separate the burnt offering in her lifetime. So apparently Rabbi Asi is saying that Rabbi Yochanan says that the property of a debtor is liened by Torah law. I mean, it's pretty interesting that you're saying that if you have a biblical obligation, a Torah obligation, as opposed to a rabbinic obligation, to bring an offering because you did something. I mean, it might be the simple case is you committed a sin, unwittingly, right? So when you violate a negative prohibition, like you shall not do work on Shabbos, right? You'll not light a candle after Shabbos has started, and unwittingly, because you didn't know that Shabbos had started, you light that candle. So now you become liable to bring a sin offering. Okay, you haven't had time to bring the sin offering, and then sadly you die. So your children inherit all your property, and let's say that you have some livestock, including some animals that could be used to bring a sin offering. So now, does the fact that the father didn't bring that sin offering in his lifetime create a lien on his property that his children have to bring that offering because it's owed to God, as it were, through that Torah obligation to bring the chatas, to bring the sin offering? And we see there's a dispute between the sages of the Mishnah about that. Rabbi Yochanan says that yes, the children have to bring that sin offering on behalf of the father, assuming they know about it, right? So the Gemara asks, but these sages already disagreed about this same issue before. Why would they engage in the same dispute with regard to multiple applications? How do we know that? As Rav and Shmuel both say, with regard to a loan that was granted by oral agreement, i.e. without a document that places a lien on the land, if the debtor dies, the creditor cannot collect the loan from the heirs or from those who purchased the land. And this is the law, even if it is clear that there was a loan, and the debtors do not dispute this fact because it wasn't done with a document, it was only an oral agreement. The lien on the land does not survive the death of the debtor, right? Or the lender. Hold on a second. So the loan was granted by oral agreement, and then the debtor dies. So the debtor dies, and so now the lender wants to go and collect from the heirs the money that the debtor did not pay in his lifetime. If it was created by oral agreement, the lender cannot collect from the heirs. If the loan was made with a written agreement, the lender can go collect from the property that the heirs inherit. Okay? So where am I? And this is the law, even if it is clear that the loan was created, and the debtors do not dispute this fact. And Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both say, with regard to a loan by oral agreement, the creditor can collect from the heirs and from those who purchased the land from the debtor. And this shows that those same sages already disagreed as to whether a lien on property exists by Torah law in the absence of a document. And the Gemara answers, no. It is necessary to teach both cases, right? That there's a lien on an animal owed to be brought as an offering, and that there's a lien on land that was used to secure a loan, but without a written agreement, only with an oral agreement. Those liens are different, and the fact that the same sages disagree in both cases, it's not the same outcome. I mean, it's not the same underlying principle, because we're going to make a distinction between, an unpaid sin offering, as it were, and an unpaid loan secured by land. Right? The Gemara answers it is necessary to teach both cases, as if it were stated only about this case of a loan, one might say it is only with regard to this situation that Shmuel says there is no lien on property, because it is a loan that is not written in the Torah. This loan is merely a private agreement between two individuals, but with regard to this obligation of a woman to bring a burnt offering after she gives birth, one might say that he concedes to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, since this woman's obligation to bring the burnt offering is written in the Torah, perhaps it creates a lien on her property despite the fact that there is no document to that effect. And conversely, had the sages taught us about their dispute only in the case of the burnt offering of a woman following childbirth, one might say that Rabbi Yochanan says that the Torah imposes a lien only in this case of the burnt offering, as a loan written in the Torah is like one written in a document. But with regard to this private loan, one might say that he concedes to Shmuel that the lien does not apply by Torah law. Therefore, it is necessary to state the dispute in both cases. Rav Papa said that the law is as follows. With regard to a loan by oral agreement, the creditor can collect from the heirs, but he cannot collect from those who purchased the property. There was a lien on it, but once it was purchased, this creditor, without a written agreement, cannot go and extract that land from somebody who purchased it from the debtor who had used it as collateral for a loan. The reason that he can collect from the heirs is that the accepted opinion is that the property of a debtor is liened by Torah law, but he cannot collect from those who purchase from the debtor because a loan by oral agreement does not generate publicity, i.e. potential purchasers will not have heard about it. Therefore, they are not careful to avoid buying property from the debtor. These purchasers should not suffer due to a lien that was not publicized. New subject. Our Mishna teaches. We're back to the Mishna number 1 of chapter 1 here in Tractate Kiddushin. The Mishna teaches, and a woman acquires herself through a bill of divorce or through the death of the husband. Right now we're actually moving away from betrothal that was mentioned in our Mishnah and to divorce, right? Because why? A woman is acquired, meaning enters betrothal and eventually the state of marriage through money or a document or sexual intercourse, and she leaves marriage through a document or through the death of the husband. And the Gemara asks, granted, this is the law with regard to a bill of divorce, as it is written explicitly in the Torah, Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 and 2. And he writes for her a scroll of severance and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house. And she departs out of his house and she goes and becomes another man's wife. She was married to one man. He gave her a get. They divorced, and then she went and married another man. Obviously, you can create divorce through a get, meaning that while she was married, she's permitted to her husband and prohibited to every other man in the world. And when he gives her that get, and that's what it actually says in the get, you are now permitted to all the men in the world, means she's free. She now can go marry whoever she wants. So this indicates that a bill of divorce enables a woman to marry whomever she wishes after the divorce. But from where do we derive that the death of the husband also enables a woman to remarry? That's just obvious to us, right? It's just we've been taking it as a given, but the sages are saying, how do we know that? How do you know that a married woman who becomes a widow is now free to marry all other men? Maybe she's not. Maybe only a get, a bill of divorce, enables her to marry other men, but a widow remains prohibited to other men. How do we know that this is not the case? And the Gemara answers, this is based on logical reasoning. He, the husband, rendered her forbidden to every man, and he has permitted her by dying. Since the husband is no longer alive, there is no one who renders her forbidden. And the Gemara asks, but consider the status of those with whom relations are forbidden, as he renders her forbidden to them, and yet he does not permit her to them when he dies. For example, one may not marry one's father's wife even after the father dies. Rather, from the fact that the Merciful One states that a Yevama, the widow of a man who died before having children, that a Yavama who does not have children from her deceased husband is prohibited from marrying anyone besides the Yavam, her surviving brother-in-law. From this, it may be inferred that a widow who has children from her deceased husband is permitted to remarry anyone she wants. And the Gemara asks, but perhaps one should infer the following from that law. A woman who does not have children from her deceased husband is forbidden to everyone and permitted to the Yavam. And a woman who has children from her deceased husband is simply forbidden to everyone. Rather, the law that the death of the husband permits a woman to marry another man is derived from a different source, from the fact that the Merciful One states that a widow is forbidden to a high priest. And this indicates that it is permitted for her to marry a common priest, and the same certainly applies to a non-priest. Right? So now that we have a prohibition in the Torah, a high priest cannot marry a widow, meaning a widow cannot marry a high priest. A high priest she cannot marry. Everyone else she can marry. And the Gemara asks, but perhaps one can say that she is forbidden to a high priest by a prohibition. A high priest cannot marry a widow, whereas she is forbidden to everyone else by dint of a positive mitzvah. The positive mitzvah meaning by a get, she is allowed to marry anyone else that she wants once she's divorced. But in the absence of a get, in the absence of that positive mitzvah to free her to marry anyone else, she cannot marry anyone else, right? The Gemara is really challenging this hard. How do we really know that a widow is free to remarry? So if the death of the husband affects her status, she should be and the Gemara asks, this positive mitzvah, what is its purpose? If the death of the husband affects her status, she should be entirely permitted. And if the death of the husband does not affect her status, she remains in her initial state when her husband was alive. And therefore, those who engage in sexual intercourse with her would be liable to receive the death penalty as if the husband was still alive and this was an act of adultery. And the Gemara answers, and why is this suggestion not considered reasonable? One could argue that the death of the husband removed her from the class of people with whom one is punished with death for engaging in intercourse, and placed her in the class of people with whom one is prohibited to engage in intercourse due to a positive mitzvah, just as it is with consecrated animals that have been disqualified. And this is referring to animals that were designated as offerings but became invalid due to a blemish, right? So if you set aside an animal to be an offering, it's consecrated. If it's a sheep, for example, you can't shear it for its wool. You can't work it. You can't use it to mow the lawn or something like that. It's consecrated. Now, if it develops a blemish, now it can't be offered up on the altar. But even though it can no longer be used as an offering, you're still prohibited to shear it or to work it. However, once it dies, or I'm sorry, not even once it dies, but you can slaughter it and eat it. You can't work it, you can't shear it, but you can eat it. So its status has changed from when it was consecrated animal that did not have a blemish. And so they're saying maybe what's going on with a widow is that if somebody, she's not permitted to remarry when the husband dies, but if somebody does sleep with her, it's not considered adultery. Rather, it's just something that is prohibited because you're violating this positive mitzvah. The positive mitzvah being by divorce, you become free to remarry. Without divorce, you're not. That's not where the law is going to come out, but they're pushing, testing, prodding to see how exactly do we know that a widow is permitted to remarry. They haven't yet fallen on the correct derivation. So they explain now how is this comparable to the consecrated animal. The Gemara explains, the law with regard to such animals is that initially, when they are unblemished, they are subject to the laws of misuse, i.e., if one benefited from them, he has misused consecrated items. And likewise, shearing them and performing labor with them is prohibited. Once these animals have developed a blemish, and one has redeemed them, right? You have to you sell the animal, as it were, you trade it for money, and you have to use that money to buy another animal because you consecrate an animal to be brought on the altar. The blemished animal can't be brought, but because you consecrate an animal, you still owe an animal to be brought as an offering. So you redeem it for money, and now you use that money to purchase another animal that will be brought as an offering. The redeemed animal, you would think, is now fully available like it was an unconsecrated animal, but some of the holiness remains, right? And that's what they're saying. And likewise, shearing them and performing labor with them is prohibited. Once these animals have developed a blemish and one has redeemed them, the prohibition against misuse of consecrated items does not apply to them, but shearing them and performing labor with them remains prohibited. Based on this example, it is possible that the death of the husband does not render the woman entirely permitted. If so, one cannot derive from here that it is permitted for a wife whose husband has passed away to marry another man. We're still looking for that proof. And I'm almost done, so questions or comments, get them in. Rather, the source that a widow may remarry is from that which the verse states, lest he die in battle and another man take her. Deuteronomy 20, verse 7. This indicates that a man may marry a widow. Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Edi, objects to this derivation. One can say, who is the other man mentioned by this verse? It is a Yavam, lest the man die in battle, and he didn't have children, so his brother is going to marry her through Yibum. But we haven't proven that just a regular widow who maybe has children with her husband, and then the husband dies, that she's permitted to marry whoever she wants. Rav Ashi said that there are two refutations to this statement, meaning that you're saying that objecting to the proof that lest he die in battle and another man take her, Rav Ashi is saying that is a valid proof that a widow may remarry. Why? Because in terms of, you can't say that this is only talking about a yavam, a yibum situation, a husband who died childless and has left a brother. Why? Because a yavam is not called another, right? Lest he die in battle and another man take her. The yavam is not just another man, he's the brother, as his relationship with her is not entirely separate from that of the first husband. And furthermore, it is written, quote, and the latter husband hates her and writes her a scroll of severance and gives it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies. Deuteronomy 24:3. Where it's discussing that a man who divorces his wife and then she goes and marries another person, he can't then, when the second husband dies, he can't marry his she can't marry her first husband because she's already had a second marriage. People can divorce and remarry only if she hasn't been with another man in the meantime. So from that verse in the Torah, what are we learning? In this manner, the verse juxtaposes death to divorce. Just as divorce permits a woman to everyone and completes the severing of a husband from his wife, thereby allowing her to marry another man, so too death permits her and completes the severing, allowing her to marry another man. So we know that a widow can remarry, but now we've got the proof from the verses in the Torah. Okay, questions or comments on Kiddushin 13? Looks like no questions or comments on Kiddushin 13 that Nina is passing to me in the Google document. Yeah, no questions. Okay, my friends, have a wonderful evening, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Good Vok, Shavua Tov. Have a great week.